Never send a man to the grocery store. Jeannie, I believe is how you say her, maybe it's Jean Robertson. She tells a story about sending her husband to the grocery store. A friend of hers was in the hospital. She wanted to take a cake, a 7-Up cake to her, but they were out. And so she was in a hurry, and she asked her husband, would you go to the grocery store for me? And he said, sure. Give me a list of the ingredients you need, and I will go to the grocery store. He said, but I'm in a hurry. I want to go play badminton. So if you could make sure that I can go through the express lane. So she gave him a list and sent him on his way. And time went by, and time went by, and time went by. She began to get worried. She thought, well, maybe he just went on and played badminton. And so she was getting ready to call the grocery store. And right as she got ready to call, she heard the door open to the house. And here comes her husband, huffing and puffing and stomping his way through the house with bag after bag on his arm. He threw him down. He went on and went back out. And he says, there's more in the car. And she thought, what in the world is going on? So she started looking. And in the first bag she found, there was a pound of margarine. Makes sense. In the second bag, she found two huge bottles of vanilla. In the third bag, she found 3 dozen eggs. And she's like, man, there must have been a sale on eggs. I don't know what's going on here. In the fourth bag, she found 4 monster containers of shortening. She's like, who could possibly use all this shortening? In the fifth bag, 5 5-pound bags of sugar. The sixth bag, 6 5-pound bags of all-purpose flour. And in the seventh, she found that he had brought 7 6-packs of 7-Up. And then she realized what had happened. Because she didn't want him to, or wanted him to be able to go through the express lane, she had numbered her list. And so on every single number, he bought that many of whatever item was there. He literally followed her directions to the T. I want to show you a couple pictures here. One's going to come up here. It says, write the following words in alphabetical order. You figuring this out yet? Whatever student this was wrote the following words in alphabetical order. She or he spelled apple, A-E-L-P-P. That's alphabetical order. Pumpkin, I-K-M-N-P-P-U. Alphabetical order. You see what's going on here? The only one that makes sense, fox down there. But all of those words, they wrote them in alphabetical order. Now that's following directions. That's taking it literal. I want to show you another picture. Here's another one. I love Hope. She's close to my heart here. It says, name the quadrilaterals. Bob, Sam, Harry, Kate. I love this. I mean, now that is taking the literal. One more I want to show you here. I like this guy. Do you see what's going on here? It says, hug left curb when leaving. And he's following the directions. That's exactly what it says. Hug left curb when leaving. When leaving. Here's the point this morning. We're going to start a new series today. I've entitled this sermon series, Sermons on the Sermon. And it is a sermon series based on the Sermon on the Mount. And if there's any sermon that you ought to listen to, it is the Sermon on the Mount. And so we're going to do sermon after sermon on the Sermon of the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. Now, I want you to understand what's going on here. Jewish people of Jesus' day have lost sight of what God really intended for them to do. Through years of misinterpretation and misunderstanding, they completely missed the point. They didn't understand what their purpose was and what they were supposed to be doing. And so Jesus preaches this powerful sermon that doesn't just correct misunderstandings, but challenges both them and us to live a life that's different. And the truth is, when people come to this Sermon on the Mount, many still have misunderstandings about it. So many people come to it with a confusion about what Jesus is trying to accomplish with this sermon. I mean, some look at it, some think that it's just for the overachievers, this Sermon on the Mount. It's like extra credit. It's like for those who want advanced placement. If you do the Sermon on the Mount, you are like the special, the super Christian. Other people look at it and they think to themselves, well, Jesus is intentionally setting the bar so high that it is out of reach for us. And he did that on purpose so that we would recognize that we need God's grace and how far short we fall. But I think that if you really want to know how to approach this powerful sermon that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of months, to be quite honest with you, you need to listen to what Jesus says about it. If you really want to know how to approach the Sermon on the Mount, you've got to look and say, how did Jesus view it? With that in mind, I want us to turn to Matthew chapter 7. If you have your Bible, it'll be on the screen here in just a second. Instead of starting at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which is where you normally start a sermon, right at the beginning, we're going to start at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. So we want to start in chapter 7, because I believe chapter 7, at the end of his sermon, Jesus makes sure that we understand how you and I are supposed to approach this sermon that he preaches. So Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29. Let me go ahead and read it to you. You're familiar with it. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell like today, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Jesus comes right out with it here. Jesus comes right out with it. He says, if you want to be wise, do what I say. That's what he says. If you want to know how to live, do what I say. That's what Jesus says here. His expectation for this sermon that he just preached is do it. Do what I say. It's not pie in the sky proposition. It's not only for the advanced Christian. Jesus says there is no better way to live your life. You need to do what I say. And then if you do what I say, you will be able to stand even when the pressures of life come against you. Now, before we get to all of the extreme challenges of this sermon that he preached, I think it's important for us to decide right here, right now, at this moment, how am I going to approach this sermon? How am I going to approach this sermon? If we're just going to listen to it, not this sermon, but Jesus' sermon, if we're just going to listen to it, then Jesus says we're foolish. If you're just here to be entertained, he says, if you're just going to listen to my words to see what amuses you, you're foolish. He says, however, if you allow this text to train you to do what I say, then you are wise. Then you are wise. Louis C.K. is a comedian. This is what he says. He says, I have a lot of beliefs, and I live by none of them. That's just the way I am. They're just my beliefs. I just like believing them. I like that part. They're my little believies. They make me feel good about who I am. But if they get in the way of the things I want, I sure as heck just do what I want to do. He essentially says, there's things in my life that I believe, but if they get in the way of me doing the things I want to do, I just put them to the side. I just don't do them. Let's be real honest about ourselves this morning. We often fall into that category, don't we? We often have the same attitude. You know, I'll believe in God when it's convenient for me to believe in God. I'll give to the Lord if I have extra in my pocket. I'll forgive someone if I'm going to get something out of it. I'll worship God when there is nothing else I'd rather do. I'll serve if I can choose how I'm going to serve and where I'm going to serve. We have our own set of believies too often. But Jesus tells us the only way to truly live is to do what I say. To do what I say. Peter Marshall, the late chaplain of the U.S. Senate, was once asked to present a method of studying the Bible. This is his method. I love this method. He advised his listeners, he said, start with Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. He said, begin with Matthew 5:1. He said, continue reading until you find a scripture telling you to do something you are not doing or telling you to stop doing something that you are presently doing. He said, when you come to that point, stop reading, mark your place, and then go and do what the Bible has told you to do. Once you have mastered that lesson, then and only then return to your Bible and begin reading where you stopped. Once again, read until you find some instructions that you need to apply. Stop at that point and go do what you should before returning to the Scriptures. And he went on to say, I guarantee that if you read the Bible in this way, you will not only change your life, you will change the world before you finish with Matthew chapter 7. What a powerful thought. How should I read the Bible? Well, start Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. And when you get to something you're not doing, start doing it. It's pretty simple. I mean, it doesn't get much easier than that. I like how Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it in The Cost of Discipleship. He said, humanly speaking, we could understand the Sermon on the Mount in 1,000 different ways. Jesus knows only one possibility: simple surrender and obedience, not interpreting it and applying it, but doing it and obeying it. That is the only way to hear his word. But again, he does not mean that it is to be discussed as an ideal. He really means us to get on with it. To get on with it. So we're going to start this series on the Sermon on the Mount. And to be quite honest with you, every single sermon is going to be challenging you to do something. So I'm just warning you in advance. If you come next week, you're going to be told to do something. If you come the next week, you're going to be told to do something. And to be quite honest, it's not me who's going to be telling you. It's God. The very Lord you say you serve is going to be telling you to do something week after week after week. But the question is, what does this passage tell us to do? What does this passage tell us to do? Well, first thing I think it tells us to do is that we need to dig deep. We need to dig deep. Jesus calls us to obedience, but then he illustrates that by giving this picture of two different houses being built. He talks about the wise house being built on the rock. He talks about the foolish house being built on the sand. Now, I want you to understand, if you were driving through this neighborhood with these two houses, they probably would have looked completely the same. Exactly the same. You drive by one and it looked exactly like the other one. But one builder took the time and paid the expense to dig down deep where they hit bedrock, while the other one took the easy way. Jesus is telling us something powerful in this illustration. He says, if you're going to do what I'm calling you to do, then you're going to have to take the time and you're going to have to be willing to dig deep. You're going to have to give it your effort. You're going to have to dig down to the rock and see that the rock is firm and unmoving and sturdy. He says you're going to have to get down to the foundation. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, this is how it defines faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Now keep that in mind, because the next verse says, or verse 6 I should say, it says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. If you're ever wanting to get encouraged about your faith, You ever wanted to be inspired about digging deep? You need to go to Hebrews chapter 11 and read that chapter. Because in Hebrews chapter 11, we see person after person after person who did something because of their faith. Noah, when warned of things unseen, built the ark. Now, I don't know what the things unseen completely means, but it appears to me, at least in my mind, that what he's saying is Noah probably never even saw rain. The atmosphere was different before the flood. This would have surprised Noah, but he built an ark based on the truth that God said, you're going to need to build an ark. And so he does. Abraham, he left his home, went out following God. Where was he going? He didn't know, but he knew who to follow. And so he followed along. If you remember later, same chapter, it talks about Abraham again. It says that he was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now it gives a little commentary in there, and it said Abraham assumed that God could raise him from the dead. If you go through it, it talks about Moses and Rahab and Israel and Gideon and Samuel and David and Samson. And all of them, if you look, it talks about what they did because of their faith. What they did. It was a doing proposition. Even when it was hard, they dug deep, and they did. And they did. And they did. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid was Rocky. Anybody like Rocky? Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, Rocky, yeah, I'm there. It's one of those inspirational movies. This down and out, mediocre boxer seizes this incredible opportunity. If you remember, Apollo Creed, the heavyweight champion of the world, is getting ready to fight an opponent. The opponent has to cancel. 3 weeks prior to the event, they're injured. And so Creed chooses a local fighter, which is Rocky, to box him. It's an amateur's dream. And so Rocky goes into intense training. And so they find an interviewer. Someone in the media comes, and they're going to interview Rocky. And so they're filming it for the news. And so they find Rocky, and he is in a freezer with a long row of beef lined up. The reporter asked Rocky, he said, is this how everyone trains? I mean, do people commonly come into and fight pounding on meat in a freezer? Is that how boxers trained? And Rocky says something like, nah, I think I invented it. The reporter asks, well, can you give me a demonstration? And he begins to punch the sides of beef. Now, the interesting thing is in the movie, while he's punching this beef and wearing this beef out, Apollo Creed's assistant is watching the interview on TV. And as he's watching it, he realizes that Rocky is invested in this fight. He is ferociously pounding this meat on the screen. And so his assistant said, hey, champ, to Apollo Creed, you've got to come and look at this boy you're going to fight on TV. He looks like he means business. Now, from the background, Creed says, yeah, I mean business too. And he says, can someone get me a cup of coffee? Now, when it comes time for the match, Rocky doesn't win the fight. But he shocks Apollo Creed in the world by going 15 rounds with the world champion. Now, the reason I bring that to your attention is there's something important about what Rocky does. He has this opportunity to fight the world champion. What does he do? He immediately goes into strict training. He starts beating himself into submission. See, in this sermon, Jesus is calling for us to dig deep. He is calling for us to get ourselves ready to go out on a limb, to accomplish something that we might think impossible, to accomplish something that the world may think is impossible. Jesus is saying, put in the work knowing that I'm with you and I'll provide for you. And there is strength if you build upon the rock. Jesus says in our sermon this morning, it is time to dig deep. Dig deep. Let me ask you, how many of us are willing to step out in faith? And what does digging deep in faith look like? You need to answer that question for you, and I need to answer it for me. But we need to start by digging deep. The second thing we need to do with this sermon is that we need to understand that understanding isn't the key. Submission is the key. Submission is the key. Jesus doesn't give us partial credit for understanding the whys of what he's calling us to do. What he simply wants is for us to submit. So often we approach God's word like a treasure map. We're looking for the intriguing. We're searching for the hidden. But Jesus calls us to approach it as a battle plan. Even if you can't see the entire picture, you listen and you submit to the commander. You listen and submit to the commander. Eric Weinmeier is blind. Yet on May 25th of 2001, he reached the peak of Mount Everest. He suffered from a degenerative eye disease, and he lost his sight when he was 13 years old, but that didn't stop him. On the mountain where 90% of climbers never make it to the top, where 165 climbers have died since 1953, Eric succeeded in large measure because he listened and obeyed. For instance, he listened to the little bell tied to the back of the climber in front of him, and then he followed that bell up the mountain. He listened to the voice of his teammates when they shouted back at him, "Death fall 2 feet to your right," and he avoided going 2 feet to his right. He even listened to the sound of his pick jabbing into the ice so he would know whether the ice was solid or not, whether he could safely cross it or not. I love Eric. He didn't constantly call out, well, why? Why should I do that? He didn't crawl over 2 feet and test to see if there was a deadfall there. Let me see if there's some. He didn't do that. He listened and he obeyed and he made it to the top of Mount Everest without sight. Without sight. You know what? Sometimes I believe a blind climber has better sight than we do. He knew who to trust, and he responded without hesitation. In James chapter 1, it says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets that what he looks like or what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing." It is important for us to do. How many times have we decided not to submit to God? God, I can't share Christ right now. I don't know enough. What if they ask me something I don't know? I can't share Jesus. God, I can't step on faith. It just isn't feasible. There's no way that could be possible. I just can't do that. Or God, I won't, and you can fill in the blank for your own life. And you can give them the reason too. But G.K. Chesterton said, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." How many times have we just refused to try what Jesus calls us to do? We started off this morning, at least with the sermon, we started off the sermon laughing at those who had taken their instructions a little too literally. You know what? The truth is, it really wasn't the followers' fault that they misunderstood. It was the assigner's fault. It was the one who gave them the orders, gave them the assignment. It was their fault. They simply did what they were told to do. To be quite honest with you, that's the call for Jesus. To just do it. To just do it. In fact, Jesus pretty much says, "I will never lead you wrong if you dig deep and you submit to me and you just do it." You don't have to understand it. You just have to do it. I love how the passage ended. Matthew 7:28 and 29. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. The crowds were astonished because they recognized that Jesus taught with authority. What about you and me? Do we recognize Jesus' authority? To be quite honest with you, your life and my life answers that question. Your life and my life answers the question of whether we recognize Jesus' authority or not.